Welcome to Wrath of the Lich King in Brief, the mini-series where we take a look at each spec by their role. As per usual, we'll be rating the classes based upon how well they perform in raids early on, how the specialization scales as the expansion goes on, complexity, how hard is this spec to pick up and play, stacking, will raids actively seek to bring more than one of them, the utility in terms of buffs and debuffs, and of course PvP. Ratings will be done from 1 to 5 stars, and here's what each star means. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, Manscaped, the global brand for men's grooming and hygiene. As is tradition with any major World of Warcraft release, many of us are going to have 1 or 2 rather long gaming sessions, and whilst you may play a torrent in-game, it's probably not a good idea to smell like one in real life. Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0 has the tools to stay sharp whilst grinding the levels in-game. The Lawnmower 4.0 body trimmer will ensure you don't have a back looking like a knoll from Redridge Mountains, and this is Manscaped's 4th generation of electric waterproof trimmer with advanced skin-safe technology, reducing nicks and cuts on sensitive regions of the body. It has a super smart cordless charging system with LED lights on the front to easily see at a glance how much juice it has left. You can tap the button 3 times on the front to enable the travel lock feature too. Also included is the Crop Preserver deodorant and Crop Reviver. Apply after a shower for all day freshness. Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping and those 2 free gifts when you use my promo code at the checkout. Many thanks to Manscaped for the sponsor. Let's talk WoW. First up, Arcane Mage. This is going to be the go-to spec early for mages, offering very high levels of burst damage. In TBC, Arcane was surprising. It remained relevant from super early, and it still is right at the end of the expansion, but for Wrath it does feel like eventually it will begin to fall off and a different mage spec will become king. For complexity, Arcane is on the simpler side of things, always has been, except now you sometimes press Arcane Missiles when you get a proc. Other than that, it's Arcane Blast all day, every day. Stacking mages is quite performance dependent, as DPS is the main thing which they are offering, and despite Arcane being good early, I think some other specs will be outdoing it. You may see a few mages in the roster, but not to the point where they're stacked excessively. Utility wise, we have the mage standard intellect, the situational amplify or dampen magics, and table. For Arcane, there's a new focus magic talent offering another member of the raid 3% crit, and of course the 3% raid wide damage buff, Arcane Empowerment. On top of that, sometimes spell steal can be clutch too, so Arcane gets an average score here. In PvP, it has more going for it than TBC with more survivability focused talents, but Arcane is still very squishy. But if you do let it cast, you can certainly delete people. Fire is expected to overtake Arcane midway through the expansion, and by ICC should be well ahead. The age-old problem with Fire is that you need a lot of crit to really make it work, with talents such as Ignite and Hot Streak really pushing Fire to be one of the top caster DPS eventually, but just don't expect much from it early game. Fire, like Arcane, very straightforward to play. It's all about landing those 2 back-to-back crits and sending in an instant pyroblast. There are more arguments for stacking a few mages in your raid, but you can also do without, so I've given them an average score here. Utility wise, again similar place to Arcane, more about the damage, but they will still have focus magic and the ability to add 5% spell crit to the target, which is nice and all, but another class which I'd expect a lot more of to be doing this already. For PvP, it feels like we're talking about Arcane again, a lot of added survivability, but it's still squishy. Saying that, Dragon's Breath Disorient now lasts 5 seconds, and Blast Wave has a knockback added onto it, so you have a lot more control as this spec. It is a very fun spec and can see good results from skilled players. Frost Mage next, and it's just not a good story in PvE this expansion. It's one of the few specs which, I mean, go for it yourself one day and see how well it performs. Arcane exists for mages early, and Fire exists later. Frost just doesn't get a look in for raiding content, and even if it did, I'd still give it a 1 on complexity. Mage is literally the only class I've done this with thinking about it. On top of that, Frost doesn't have any special utility that the other specs don't do either, and I suppose this is because Frost is the PvP spec for mages this expansion. Frost has always been a spec that has control and burst, and in Wrath the likes of Deep Freeze is added for another huge stun and freeze effect, as well as Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze giving you more access to instant cast damaging spells. Expect to see a ton ton of Frost Mages in arenas and battlegrounds during Wrath. On to the Laser Chicken, the Boomy, or more commonly known, the Balanced Druid. Few specializations in the game can match the burst AoE that the Boom King can put out with Starfall into Hurricane. Oh, and the cooldown from Hurricane has been totally removed, by the way. Just make sure you aren't pulling the whole room by accident with Starfall though. They start off with incredible AoE and respectable single target, and they also scale fairly well on top of that. Maybe I should have gone for a 3 for scaling, but I've seen some really good numbers from Boomkins late into ICC, so I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here. For complexity, there's two main things which you are thinking about: rocking your Eclipse at the correct time, which will empower your main spells, and snapshotting as many effects as possible for your Starfall. It does seem all quite simple, but there are a few considerations that will set players apart here. In terms of stacking, well, you don't hate to see it, but I still think Boomies are in that one of specialization category, similar to how they were in TBC. Boomkin utility is even better than TBC with the Druid standard buffs in Innovate, Battle Res, and now they bring 3% haste, 5% spell crit, and 3% spell hit for your raid, making them more than just a great addition to about any team. In terms of PvP, whilst they have come a long way since TBC, offering much better damage and having more CC options, they still fall into that category of being quite easily shut down just by being hard focused, so I've given them an average score here. Elemental Shaman feels like a much more involved spec than it did in TBC, but in many ways it undergoes the same experience. Start of expansion, it looks great, able to push performance super well. By the end of the expansion, it's fallen down the meters somewhat. Elemental just doesn't scale too well, unfortunately, and Wrath really doesn't change that. The spec is also on the simple side to play, though now you have to make sure that you weave in a few lava bursts and that Flame Shock remains on the target all the time. Also, you have to Flame Shock before lava burst in Wrath. You can't do it when the spell is in mid-air. They changed it to work like that in retail a while ago. It was a simple rotational change, but it made Elemental feel so much better. The stacking, essentially, no. I mean, you can if it comes to it, but people won't be seeking out multiple Elemental Shamans for their roster. Utility-wise, they're actually really strong. Of course, bringing Heroes More Bloodlust, 5% spell crit, 3% flat crit, 5% spell haste, Totem of Wrath, which is a nice bump in spell damage, and more. It just tends to be the case that other classes, which are going to be more popular, have filled those requirements. Hard to bring the player, not the class at work here. PvP-wise, this spec is a complete monster, and for me is the top caster spec of the expansion, though only just narrowly. There's some very powerful classes out there. I want to say whatever level you PvP at, be it arena or casual battlegrounds or anything in between, Elemental is a great pick. Super high burst damage, good survivability, a hard CC in Hex, an interrupt from Wind Shear. This spec just got giga buffed from TBC. I'd say the most overall buff spec for PvP in the game. Beast Mastery Hunter, where did it all go wrong? One of the best single target PvE specs for the entirety of TBC, and then we get to Wrath and people don't want them in the raid anymore. The updates that Wrath brought for BM just didn't hit the mark this expansion for PvE. Even the new exotic pets failed to bring anything unique to the table other than saying, hey, look at me, I've got a dinosaur for a pet. It's a similar story to Frost Mage. A better spec exists early and late in the expansion, leaving BM out. Beast Mastery doesn't even really find its footing too well in PvP either. I'd expect it to be played early on a little bit when resilience is low and it's part of the infamous Beast Cleave comp, but whilst it can put out some very big numbers in the opener, it's super lacking on the utility side of things. Marksman, however, is in a great spot for Wrath. It's solid enough early on to try it out and see if you're curious how well it will perform, but it really does need a bunch of armor penetration to start putting out the damage it's capable of. Expect most players to opt into the other spec we haven't talked about yet early on. As we progress on with gearing, Marksman is a late game machine which can absolutely blast crits non-stop and is super satisfying to play. So in terms of complexity, Hunters need something to be said about them. In the Burning Crusade there was this thing called melee weaving. This was running into melee range in between auto shots to swing with your melee weapon. This worked because ranged and melee auto swings were tracked separately. In Wrath they are tracked together, which means you can't do this anymore. If melee weaving was in the game, Hunters would have had the highest skill cap of any class by so far it's not even close. But since it's not, they are more average, with a more ability comes off cooldown, press ability type rotation. Though you do have a pet to manage too, and in Wrath, pets aren't always very smart, so an average score here. Utility, not too much that's special if I'm honest, but hunters have one of the most important abilities in the game. Misdirection. Pulling mobs that have just spawned on the other side of the room, or just giving your tanks a huge threat lead, is such a useful thing to be able to do. In PvP, this specialization has totally changed in the way that it plays from TBC, where you'd often focus on gradually wearing people down. Now for Wrath, Aim Shot is instant cast and still applies a Mortal Strike type effect. You have Deterrence to help survivability, Master's Call is a Hand of Freedom type effect. You even have a Disarm thanks to Chimera Shot. On top of that, Marksman puts out some nasty burst damage with their standard rotation of abilities coming up every so often. Expect plenty of hunters at high ranks in Arena during Wrath. Next, Survival. So we expect Survival to be the go-to hunter spec early on, and even saying that, I think people are sleeping on it a bit. The AoE this spec puts out is very impressive through a glyphed explosive trap, which allows the periodic effect to crit as well as volley. Their single target is pretty awesome at the same time. It's also worth a note at the moment Blizzard are considering buffing Ulduar gear, so Survival might remain the played hunter spec for a pretty sizable portion of the expansion. Later on, people will consider the reroll to Marksman when we get deep into the expansion, but I still think Survival will be decent. There's more going on with Survival than Marksman too, with you going into melee range to place traps to force certain procs, as well as making sure you don't clip your explosive shots. And of course, it's still a pet class. Utility-wise, it's good for all the same reasons that Marksman is, except you can generate much better AoE threats because your traps do a ton more damage. In PvP, it's not half bad either, offering good, consistent damage, but often lacking the utility that Marksman can bring. Shadow Priests have been putting up way better numbers than I thought they would in early raids. Shadow Form gets mega buffs, so now all of your dots crit, and most of them benefit from haste, giving the priest access to much better damage as well as scaling. On top of that, you have Mind Seer, so when it's time to AoE, you aren't just sitting there feeling sad anymore. For scaling, they definitely improve as time goes on, but just not quite at the same rate as some other specializations do. I'd expect them to be more middle of the pack as we progress the expansion. Complexity is very similar to how Shadow has been just about forever. Maintain your damage over time effects, except you now have a new one in your kit, Devouring Plague. There will be some opportunities to snapshot Shadow Word Pain, as Mind Flay will refresh its duration, but other than that, it does feel quite similar to how Shadow Priests have played for a long time though, just with a bit faster paced gameplay. Stacking wise, well, no, really, it's not something people will be looking to do, but you'll definitely want Shadow Priests as a one-off, but often not more than that. For utility, they're still good, but their role has totally changed here. Back in TBC, they were notorious as mana batteries. They restored thousands of mana back to their party over a fight. Now in Wrath, this mana regen effect is gone, and instead they have replenishment, and you need 2 people doing this for a 25-man raid to fully benefit. What they do bring that is unique is Dispersion, a 90% damage reduction. Anytime there is a big soaking mechanic, you just throw your Shadow Priest at it, and they're more or less guaranteed going to live. In PvP, this spec also gets majorly buffed with far better damage, CC, and survivability. They have a Disarm from Psychic Horror, the standard AoE Fear and Silence they've always had. Fade now removes slowing effects, and Dispersion will guarantee that you live something. And if Vampiric Touch is dispelled now, it'll hit the target back hard. If a Shadow Priest is given uptime on a target, their health bar just absolutely disappears. Very scary class to play against this expansion. You'll be seeing them a lot more than you did in TBC. Which leaves us with Warlock, Affliction first. What can I say? They start off very strong in tier 7 and just keep getting better and better. Affliction gets a very powerful execute phase added into Drain Soul, and with health bars being buffed in Nax by 30% and a planned pre-nerf Ulduar, that's setting them up very nicely. They continue to improve as the expansion goes on and should always be among the top DPS, perhaps until very late into the expansion when your melee start picking up Shadowmourne. At a base level of complexity, I'd say Affliction is fairly straightforward to get good results from. It's just maintaining a number of dots, pressing Haunt, and using your filler spell. You can however get very min-maxy with this spec, between snapshotting, weapon swapping for buffs, and so on. There is a lot of optimization to be done here. Stacking wise, Affliction will be the most stacked DPS DPS specialization in the game for the majority of the game. They are just always good and add a huge amount of value to any raid team with their performance, which is fortunate because they don't really do all that much utility wise. The main benefits are just your Warlock standard soul and health stones. In PvP the specialization is good too, though the most notable change from TBC is that Warlocks feel a lot more squishy and really need to make the most of Demonic Circle to stop melee from running them down, though Affliction remains a high pressure specialization, making the most of their damage over time effects. Next, Demonology. Hey, that's what I'm going to be playing. No bias though, I'll say what I really think about it. And early game it's expected to be very good, offering amazing AoE burst and upper tier single target damage. Your demon, which will be a Felguard, also really starts to do some noticeable damage in Wrath too. And that's another change I suppose I should mention. Warlocks will be using demons now. If you've been playing a lock in PvE since Classic, you nearly always sacrificed your demon or had an imp just standing there AFK in phase shift, because if they get hit by anything they just fall over. The demonic sacrifice talent has also been completely removed from the game, so now we are actually a proper pet class. Scaling wise, Demonology won't be going up and up like Affliction will and remains more consistent, even to the point of falling off just a little. Stacking wise, this could be interesting actually. Early on it may be the case you just have all your Warlocks play Demonology if the spec is clearly outperforming Affliction, in which case they should be getting a 5 here, but Demo is typically seen as a one-of specialization, and that's what they'll become eventually, so that's why I've gone with this score. For utility, Demonology Warlocks have perhaps the single best buff in the entire game, and that is not an exaggeration. Demonic Pact gives your entire raid 10% of your spell power when your demon crits. This is kind of a big deal. No other class has a scaling buff. Blizzard have also implemented a quality of life change where a lower value buff cannot overlap a higher value one, meaning you don't have to mess about micromanaging your demon either, which is a super nice change. In PvP, you run in, you press Metamorphosis, you hope that things have gone well, because outside of that cooldown you really don't have much going for you. Finally, Destruction Warlock. It's become less of a consideration for PvE than it was in TBC, but it's actually not half bad. Definitely not in the same category as BM Hunter or Frost Mage here. The question is, why would you play this when Affliction and Demonology exist? The answer is probably Chaos Bolt looks cool, and I can't argue with that. Give it a go on a farm raid one day, see what you think of it. It remains fairly consistent too throughout the expansion, but just isn't on the same level as the other two specializations. It's fairly simple to play too, though has a few more buttons than the TBC version of Destruction did, which, you know, isn't exactly a tall order. Stacking wise, I don't see a case where that would happen. The utility is also very standard Warlock offerings, nothing special to highlight here. PvP is where Destruction truly shines in Wrath, getting mega buffed compared to TBC. This specialization puts out some of the nastiest burst damage of any caster, and Chaos Bolt might work a little differently from what you remember too. It doesn't always crit in Wrath, instead it pierces barriers and cannot be resisted. At one point in Wrath it used to go through damage reduction effects and immunities as well, which, you know, got nerfed. As with the other Warlock specs in PvP, you are much more prone to getting rushed down than you currently are, so good positioning is key. And those are the casters for Wrath of the Lich King Classic, all done. A lot to look forwards to here. Every caster has a much more involved playstyle. Very few one-button simulators are left over from TBC, which I'm very happy about. A couple specs get incredibly well buffed in PvP content too. That's about everything though. Thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.